on then to Sarah Longland's presentation. Now, she's the Chief Exec of the CLES Centre and about local economic strategies. And Sarah is an expert, and you'll hear that in a second, on regional and local economic development. And she argues for economic and social justice all the time, and the creation of places which enable people to live good lives. And we've heard some of that. What does that look like? And young people are telling us what that looks like, especially about equality, but not a command and control model of work, that's for sure. So before she joined the centre in 21, Sarah was the director of the IPPR in North and dedicated think tank for the North of England. And she previously worked for CLES until 2011, came back, saw the wisdom of coming back, I think, in 2021, and began her career in local government as well, working in County Durham and North Yorkshire. So has a wealth of experience in all of these things. She has a PhD in urban studies from the University of the beautiful city of Glasgow. So thank you very much, Sarah, for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that really warm introduction and for the invitation to come along today. It's been so interesting to listen to all the contributions, and I was particularly struck by Mark Drakeford's discussion of how do you get big things done, and that it starts with getting small things right, and then those add up to a really larger impact. And I suppose it speaks to some of the work that I'm going to speak about today, where lots of local councils, local organisations have been doing small things to change how they spend money, how they think about assets, how they understand their local economy, and that starts to add up to something really important in terms of an approach to thinking about local economic strategy. So I want to try and sort of speak a little bit to that today, but I do have some slides. So shall I share them from my screen? Would that be the best thing to do?
Either works. If you want to try sharing them first.
Let me see if I can. I don't think I can. If you can give me sharing rights, then yeah. I'll be able to do that. But just while we're waiting for that, just to tell you a little bit about CLES. So CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, we were set up back in the 1980s. By another very fraught time. A lot of big changes came to local councils at that point in our history, and CLES was set up by local councils as a way to try and think about how do we make sense and how do we intervene effectively to really create good economies for people, for place, and of course increasingly for planet as well. So that's so if you can just move to the next slide, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. So CLES. We are a national organisation, so we work across the UK, and we particularly in Wales, done a lot in Wales in recent years with public service boards, with the Welsh Government, and also very work very closely with Compass and with Sarah and Derek over the years. We are also doing some work in Republic of Ireland at the minute as well, which is interesting because they too are really keen to learn what are the economic alternatives at a time when they are being kind of really steamrolled, if you like, by a very aggressive property market. So that's a little bit about what we are. We are a think tank, but we like to think of ourselves as much more of a think and do tank, because we like to get involved at a local level in the business of delivery. How do you start to create change? Not only nationally, but at the local level, because we think that is where you can make the most difference to people's lives. And the other thing about us that I think is distinctive from a lot of think tankery, if you like, is that we're interested in trying to influence policy at the local level. A lot of think tanks want to whisper in the ears of national politicians. We're interested in how do you change stuff on the ground. And we take that kind of inspiration from the fantastic work we see in Wales and across the UK at a local level, where people are working really hard to change things almost from the inside out, if you like, and particularly at a time in England where things are very difficult for progressive thinkers at the local level, given our national context. So just to say as well, it was interesting, that conversation about a 4-day week. We have been piloting a 4-day week at CLES over the last 6 months. So I'm really happy to share some of our insights on that. But I personally think it's been fantastic for us, and we've learned a lot about how we work and about the benefits of that type of work in our own work. So that's a little bit about us. Today I want to talk about community wealth building. So CLES has always been an organisation which has been interested in how do you create and support the development of good local economies. But over the last 10 years, we've become particularly focused on the idea of community wealth building, and we think we've played a role in helping to really cement this as part of an alternative local economic strategy in many areas. And community wealth building really starts from the idea that wealth is all around us. Wealth in all its forms it is already here, and the sort of traditional economist view of the world is that you've got kind of scarcity and you've got lots of wants, and we argue that actually there's a lot of wealth already in our society in all its forms: natural wealth, the wealth of people, as well as monetary and financial wealth. And what we need to think about is not that we don't have enough wealth in the country, not that we don't have enough growth, but that growth and that wealth is unfairly shared, and we need to do much more to make sure that wealth is flowing effectively within our country, but within our communities as well. We're all familiar with with areas where we've perhaps grown up in, or where we live now, or that we've spoken to other people about, where there is perhaps lots of new wealth coming in, but very little of that making appreciable difference to the people who really need it, in terms of jobs, in terms of incomes, in terms of work and conditions. So the community wealth building is really about how do we direct that wealth? How do we get that wealth flowing to the places that really need it most, and start to really reverse that disparity that we see all around our country? Next slide, please. So that's just a little bit of a sort of shorter way of saying what I've just said. So community wealth building, an approach to local economics, which is about increasing the flow of wealth within local economies, and it's building wealth from within and recognizing the value of what you've got already. And it's arguing against the idea of extractive economics, and arguing instead for diverse jobs, diverse ownership, good use of land and assets in the public interest. And cities and places where progress is measured by how well economies generate good lives rather than simply the growth of GDP. So next slide, please. So in community wealth, we talk about it having 5 pillars, if you like, or they could be levers, they could be principles, but 5 kind of key tenets, if you like, or pillars of how you can drive community wealth in your area. The first is around finance, and I thought Richard's presentation gave us some really good insights into how we can use finance to really ensure that flows of investment, financial institutions really work properly for local people, communities, and for businesses. Second one around workforce. So how do you increase fair work and develop local labour markets that support the well-being of communities? And when we think of the public sector, local councils, health boards, these are all organisations that employ people. So they're not just delivering a service, they have an economic role to play. And we should be using that economic role to maximise benefits and to raise standards in terms of employment across the economy. So things like the real living wage, but also just in terms of progressive ways of paying conditions like the 4-day week indeed. So that's the second. Third, around land and property, maximising the value that local communities receive from land and property assets. Now that could be through the planning system, but it can also be through direct transfer of assets if it's appropriate, but also thinking about the tax and how development money is often siphoned off from Wales and other parts of the UK to shareholders and to people who have no connection with the place. How do we get more of that wealth? How do we get more of those benefits rooted locally? And also, how do we use the public sector's land and assets to really set the standard and to really push the benefits in terms of ownership and in terms of affordability, particularly in housing. Fourthly, around spending, and this is often where procurement comes into the piece. How do you really maximise the community benefits, the social value that you can get through the way in which the public sector spend its money? Now that might be about working more cooperatively with the private and community and voluntary sector, but it might also be about deciding to take services in-house, to in-source services again. And we've written a toolkit with the Welsh Government about how to in-source, because we think in-sourcing needs to be part of that spending conversation. And then finally about ownership, inclusive ownership. And for us, ultimately, this is all about democratizing the economy. And how do we make sure that all of us have greater ownership and greater agency, if you like, over how the economy operates.
What about a minute left, I'm afraid.
Okay, no problem. So next slide, please. And we also talk about the 5 pillars, but we also talk about anchors, because anchor organisations are those organisations that are rooted in place, that are never going to go anywhere, that have a real sense of belonging and economic connection to an area. And really how you can drive the 5 pillars through anchors to really unpack and really reveal benefits for local communities. So the idea of anchor organisations is really kind of foundational to the community wealth building approach. And I think there's a lot of synergy with the idea of foundational economy in Wales. So just the last few slides, there's a few examples here of where this is played out in practice. So in Manchester, we've done a lot with them, looking at their procurement and how they could really use their procurement to drive benefits for their most deprived neighbourhoods. Next slide is example from Birmingham, where anchor organisations, hospitals, the council, housing associations have come together to see how could they use their combined heft to really support employment, good employment, and also kind of challenging the traditional approach to recruitment. And then finally, there's a whole host of information on the CAS website. I've just put some of the hyperlinks in there, which will take you directly to that information. And happy to take any further questions. And my contact details are right at the end there too. So if you'd like to find out more, please get in touch. But thank you very much.
10 minutes is never enough, is it? It just isn't. Yeah, but it was a fantastic presentation with a huge wealth of information that you brought to us. And I highly recommend those hyperlinks because there's an awful lot of information there that is of practical use. And that's really what today partly is about. And I'm a county councillor in Cardiff and certainly will be exploring so much more in the coming year about what more we can do. So I've got a question. Thank you very much, Sarah. We've got a question from Chris about referring to inclusive ownership. Cooperatives are mostly small and bottom up, but not top down. So how might we bring about the inclusive ownership you refer to?
Can you just repeat the question, Jackie? Sorry.
Of course, yeah, thank you. So you were referring to inclusive ownership in your presentation?
Yes.
So cooperatives are mostly small and not bottom up. Bottom up, not top down.
Yeah.
So how might we bring about the inclusive ownership you refer to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think ownership doesn't have. I think from our point of view, I would certainly not be arguing that ownership needs to be a top-down process. I guess I would be arguing that what can you do through national policy, but also local policy to really enable that ownership to create the conditions for greater ownership of our economy. And I think cooperatives are central to that because they are bottom up and because they do represent communities of interest as well as geographical communities. And I think there's I think they provide a really important mechanism whereby ownership can occur. And we've seen that particularly through things like worker co-ops, taking greater ownership of employment. But I know that there are many different ways of, there's many different forms of cooperatives. So I think that it's almost like that sort of piece by piece, place by place, having cooperative organisations taking ownership and having that sense of agency over their economic destiny, if you like. I think that's a really important, powerful part of how community wealth building can happen. But I think it can only happen if you've got public sector organisations who are willing to work with cooperatives, willing to be supportive of cooperative action, and to appreciate the value that can bring to a place. And I think that can be a challenge, and that people don't necessarily understand the importance and value that the cooperatives can bring to that conversation. But it needs to be a cooperation. It can't just be public sector here and cooperatives there. There's got to be something that we bring that agenda together, root it in the idea that we've all got that shared interest in improving place.
I want to push back on that for a minute, if I may. I'm going to take the chair's privilege here. It's like John Lewis model, which isn't necessarily public as well.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is, like, I was 2021. I was a long time in Pembrokeshire, and I noticed that little things made a huge difference. So, for example, local producers setting up a website amongst the people in the area, saying, right, I've produced, I don't know, 2 tons of or 2 bags of potatoes, Pembrokeshire potatoes, no, not stereotyping at all, who would like to buy them, via a platform. So those kind of things, and keeping the wealth in the community. So there's little things like that, but there's huge things like John Lewis as well, and local authorities, procurement, etc., etc. So there's many, many different ways, isn't there?
No, and I think, I suppose I've maybe not explained that very well, but I think it's that diversity that is important. And I don't think, when I'm thinking about cooperatives, I'm not thinking of the John Lewises of the world. I'm thinking of, what happens at, not really at a local level necessarily, but a neighbourhood level. And I think that to me is a much more important and powerful model than John Lewis. I mean, that's just a sort of a, it's acting in this, it's acting in its own interest, I think. Whereas those small cooperatives will be acting in the interest of a neighbourhood or of a specific community of people who've come together because they recognise that by cooperating and by working together, they can be greater than the sum other parts. So I think that's where we need organisations that, in local government and in other, health boards, other organisations, to appreciate the value of that and to work with them in a kind of cooperative way. So
yeah, okay. Very well pushed back against me, that's for sure. So, I'm going to move to a question here I've got about a book that is being mentioned by Ian, and that is Les Huckfield, How Blair Killed the Co-ops. Might be a controversial thing to say, I don't know. I don't know if you're aware of it. I'm not aware of it, I'm sorry, I can't speak to it at all. But
I am aware of it. I can't say I've read it, but I think that I don't think New Labour's record on cooperatives was one to write home about. And sorry, I'm just having a little bit of difficulty with just trying to see the questions. I think there's a real issue for New Labour to. Sorry, I'm just being accosted by a 3-year-old. There's a real issue, I think, for Labour to kind of decide where they are on this, because they've been nationally this is very kind of lukewarm on really understanding the power and value of the cooperative movement, and on, I have to say, on community wealth building as well in recent times. We've got lots of Labour councils who get this stuff and are trying to push it forward in their own areas, but I don't think they're necessarily getting the support nationally. And I think there's a real opportunity, because we're seeing in England particularly community wealth building emerge, led by councils, independent of what Westminster is saying. So imagine if we had, a Labour government at Westminster who did appreciate the value of it and did appreciate the value of organisations like cooperatives. I mean, what more could be achieved? So I think I find that really frustrating, and particularly that kind of New Labour's attitude to it, I think is really unhelpful.
I'd want to acknowledge what Councillor William Powell, he's a great friend of Europe, I know. We've had a few discussions about that, saying in the chat as well. So I do draw your attention to that, about Lib Dem councillors and Welsh Labour working together in a progressive partnership. And of course, in the European Parliament, as some of you well know, we have to work across the aisle. Well, we had to work across the aisle all the time. It was the normal way of working. It's a grown-up way of working, I think, that doesn't lead to these divisions. I mean, it can do, but it's much better. And it can lead to complete shift in the way people work.
Yeah, so just to come in on that, Jackie, I think it's a really good point. We've worked with councils of all political complexions over the years, and absolutely.
Would be daft not to. Sorry, but not you, but it would be. So I'm going to go to David Smith for the final question, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I did put it in the chat. I don't know why it hasn't come up.
I didn't see it.
Sarah, the question is to you. And could you tell us a little bit about your work in Wales and what your successes have been working with local authorities and Compass and so on?
Yeah, so we did a piece of work with the public service boards in Wales, looking at how do you encourage cooperation between those anchor organisations at a sub-regional level, and that was those kind of groupings were fairly new in many cases, and I think it was really for some of the, I think they all worked at different paces because they were all at different stages in that journey. But I think there was a real recognition in many areas. I think sometimes it isn't always obvious to public sector organisations that they have got that economic role to play, that they have got that economic power. And I think for some places it was kind of a little bit like, oh yeah, right, well, I haven't thought about it, that I'm an employer, that I got a direct role in the economy. And I think that was I think there was quite a lot of shifts in terms of people's mindset around that. But I think that did vary by geography. And the other thing that the work that we've been involved with is in hyrwyddo, where we've been working very closely with the health board there and looking, and I think that's been a bit of a change for them too, to be able to recognise the fact that the health board had a direct economic influence, and that by having that economic influence in a more deliberate way, that they could have a benefit on many of the people that use their services. So kind of recognising that relationship between good work and good health, and then more recently we've done a piece of research looking at employee ownership, which of course is one of the Welsh government's there's an ambition in the programme for government to double the number of employee-owned businesses in this parliament, and that piece of work drew on research with organisations to really explore, well, what are some of the opportunities of employee ownership, what are some of the challenges, and put forward a series of recommendations, which we were delighted were given an audience by Minister for the Economy on, and and a commitment to try and see how we could incorporate some of those in future. So I think it's a lot of our work there has been about how to get people to start thinking about how you work with more intent to deliver economic and social benefits using public resources. And I think it's been really good to see, for example, in the social partnership and procurement bill, a real recognition of the potential of that. And I think community development is a way to kind of deliver, I suppose. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And the other Sarah, who's going to speak next, is also going to be progressing on some examples as well, because you work closely together as well. Thank you so much for the inspirational talk and the fantastic work that you keep doing, and keep it close. Yeah.
Thanks, Roel.
Thank you.